Thanks for downloading this episode of Cork Talk with me, Tim Atkin. A weekly conversation with some of the most famous people in the world of wine.
This podcast is brought to you in partnership with Noma Cork by Vinventions. Driven by a commitment to innovation, the new plant-based Noma Cork Green Line offers significant improvements in wine closure performance. Thanks to a rigorous oxygen ingress rate, you can decide which cork is best for your wine, whether it's for young and fresh wines or for those with ageing potential.
Once dubbed Miss Oblivious because of her single-minded focus, Zelma Long has had a remarkable 50-year career as a winemaker on 3 different continents. Our chat covered her early years as a dietitian, the pioneering work she did alongside the legendary Robert Mondavi in the early 1970s, her successful decision to invest in South Africa with her husband, viticulturist Phil Freese, her interest in Native American art, and why wine is an opportunity to do other things. Hello, Zelma. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Tim. Good to be here.
It's fascinating to talk to you. Can't wait. Now, tell me where you are. You're not in California at the moment, are you?
No, we're in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where we have a little casita, and we love Santa Fe.
Well, knowing you guys, you've probably planted vineyards down there as well, have you, or not?
Well, we've certainly tried some of the state's wines, which are pretty much non-professional.
So what, do you drink them or not?
We did taste them. We did a tasting with some friends here of all the New Mexico wines we could find. And we think they're working on, there is one business, which is French, which produces sparkling wines that are good. So it's not
crossed.
a place, Tim.
Yeah. Listen, I want to talk about your amazing career that you've had in wine, but let's just begin with where you were brought up and born, which was in Oregon, yeah, not in California, on the Columbia River. Just, were your parents interested in wine, and was wine part of your life growing up? Were there vineyards nearby?
Nobody drank wine in Oregon at that time. You know, my parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles drank cocktails. No one talked about wine.
And no vineyards?
I believe there were some old grapevines in the Dalles that were planted historically, but I don't know for sure. And no one ever talked about wine. It was pre-wine in Oregon.
Pre-wine, the free wine days. And you went and studied general sciences, Oregon State University, and then you end up doing an internship at the University of California, San Francisco Medical Center, and you got a job as a dietitian, didn't you?
Yeah, my internship was in dietetics at the hospital there. And then I worked in East Bay at a major hospital as a dietitian for, I think, 2 years. Then we moved up into nearby the Napa Valley, where Bob's parents had a little vacation spot in the hills. And they decided to buy some land, an old farm, and plant a vineyard. That was 1966.
This is Bob Long, your first husband, yeah?
Bob Long's parents, which are Bob Sr., decided to plant a vineyard in Napa Valley before almost anyone else. Charles Krug was there, Christian Brothers was there, and a few other wineries. But he was early in thinking about vineyards.
And what did they plant?
They used the Napa County Farm Advisor, who advised them to plant Riesling, but not Chardonnay, because Chardonnay was too difficult to grow, and it was not productive. So they planted Riesling and a small amount of Chardonnay, and both made wonderful wines. But the Chardonnay was really spectacular, and we started in 1977. Bob and I started taking those grapes, which had previously been sold, for example, to Mike Gergich, and make them for our own small business startup, which we called Long Vineyards.
And when was the first vintage of Long Vineyards where you made it yourself? When was that?
1977. It was a Chardonnay.
Yeah. So between 66 and 77, obviously you were growing grapes, but then you were selling the grapes to other people, really.
It wasn't us. It was Bob Long's parents that had that property in that vineyard. So they were selling the grapes until we decided we wanted to buy them, essentially. But it wasn't a large production. I think there was 7 acres of Riesling and Chardonnay.
And at that point you thought, hey, I might have a future in this, did you?
I had started working at Robert Mondavi in 1970. Prior to that, I'd been going to school at UC Davis studying enology and viticulture. And I was just in the middle of a master's degree when Mike Gergich called me in the summer of 1970 and said that he had gotten my name from one of my professors and would I like to come work harvest? And I said, well, I don't think so. I'm going back to school. My mother's visiting right now, but thank you. So he called back the next day and he said, this is going to be the best learning experience you can imagine, much better than going back to school this fall. So I agreed and I went to work as an intern at Robert Mondavi Winery in 1970.
And so you stopped doing your master's in enology and viticulture. You never finished it, did you?
No, I mean, it was so much fun. It was so interesting to work in the winery. And Robert Mondavi was very forward thinking. There were only 19 wineries in Napa Valley at that time, and he had started in 1966. And he was always trying new things. It was very fun to work there. Everybody was my age. You know, there weren't any really experienced people. But we did a good job.
I mean, he started that winery, in his mid to late 50s, didn't he?
Yeah, I think he was about 55 when he started.
Amazing. Just tell us what California was like in those days. You say there were only 19 wineries. I mean, what was there a buzz starting, when you get onto the beginning of the 70s, after what Mondavi had done in 66?
I think the 70s were certainly a time of significant development because wine was new to most Americans. It was being quite well promoted coming from California, and you could sell as much wine as you could make. There was a bottomless market, and so more people came in. But it was slow. I mean, we spent the era of the 70s really experimenting with winemaking and taking the grapes that were available.
And what was Mondavi like? I mean, I've met him a couple of times, and even when he was old, he was still this incredible presence, quite small in stature, but what a kind of aura, yeah?
Yes, in it, he was amazing, incredibly focused, very good-natured. He was inspiring, and he had a saying, we're going to stand with the finest wines of the world. And he would repeat that. And one time we would come up and taste together with Bob and me and some other people. I was young. One time I said to him, Bob, I could bring my recorder and we could just record this and then you wouldn't have to say it so often. And he just laughed and carried on.
And what was his focus in those days? Was it Cabernet and Chardonnay? What did he start with when he started making wine?
Cabernet, Chardonnay, Riesling, a couple of rosé of Cabernet, Sylvaner, and he had to take in some grapes that he wasn't interested in, like Carignan, because the growers really didn't have that much Chardonnay and Cabernet. So a grower would have some and he'd buy it, and then he'd take in some of the other grapes, we'd make them, and then they'd be sold up. It was kind of a wild time.
And what were the most planted grapes in the valley at the time? Was it things like Zinfandel and, Napa Gamay? What was there?
Napa Gamay was there, and we made Napa Gamay. We didn't make, there was a little Zinfandel, but most of that was in Sonoma County. Although we did make some Zinfandel, I made some Petite Syrah. As far as what was most planted, I don't know.
I mean, were you just thrown in at the deep end?
Yes. Yeah. I'll tell you another funny story, Tim. When I started work with Mike Gergich at Mondavi, I was the person that was going around and taking the samples from the fermenters, and we were tasting them together. And he was then making decisions about what to do. And I was doing some lab analysis. It was pretty basic. And then every day, Bob Mondavi would come around and taste the fermenters with us. And he had ideas about the way it should be. And for example, I think early on, he felt the fermentations should ferment quite cool, let's say 55 degrees. And then 2 years later, he felt they should ferment warmer, let's say 62 degrees. So, there was this kind of... Now, Mike Gergich was a very experienced winemaker. He was trained in Yugoslavia, and then he'd worked with Telechev and Lee Stewart, so he really knew what to do. But Bob had the enthusiasm. He was a marketing guy.
Just tell us what it was like working as a woman in the business at that time. And somebody once called you Miss Oblivious, I think probably at that time, because you were very good at turning a deaf ear to the sexism and the sort of prejudice against you. I just wonder what it was like then and how much has changed now. Is it much easier being taken seriously, do you think, as a female winemaker at the age you were then, now?
Well, those are a lot of questions.
Sorry.
Let's start with then.
Yeah.
I really didn't. Well, first of all, Miss Oblivious. Miss Oblivious is kind of my name, not only at work, but at home, because I was so focused. I was so focused, I really didn't see what was going on around me. I sat at an airport gate one time waiting to fly from Portland to San Francisco, and I was reading this fascinating article in the New York Times, and when I finished, I looked up, and everybody was gone. And I went to the podium, and the stewardess said, "Look, we've been calling your name, and finally the plane is gone." So I had an incredible ability to focus, let's put it that way. And it's been very useful.
The sexism side of it, was that a big thing then?
Well, I worked for Mike for a couple of years until he went to Chateau Montelena. Then I was promoted into his job. And I remained there until 1980 or late 79 when I was recruited for Zemi. And I think, it was sort of normal for those times. Let's just say I was focused on doing what I wanted to do. And that's the way I am. And so I didn't have a lot of, it was a little bit before to leading awareness of sexism in the workplace. I did, for example, one time we had a winemaker come in from France because we had people coming all the time through the winery. And I had a guy who was working for me as an assistant. The two of us sat down with him. And so he turned to my assistant and asked about the winemaking. And I had to correct him. But, that wasn't unusual. I was unusual as a winemaker.
Yeah. I mean, you were, as you said, very focused and very successful at Mondavi. You became chief enologist, and then you left to join CIMI, as you said, in the Alexander Valley, Sonoma County. Just tell us how different Napa and Sonoma are as places, because there's quite a rivalry between them, isn't there?
Well, there's different then and different now. Different then, when I left Mondavi, they were just starting the Opus project. So Napa there was a lot more planting, taking out the old vines, putting in Cabernet and Chardonnay. It was beginning to get more professional and sophisticated. But Napa Valley is geographically very different from Sonoma County, which will always create the differences. Sonoma County was settled mostly by Italian immigrants, and they brought over their grapes like Zinfandel. There was a lot of Zinfandel planted. But geographically, Sonoma County has a long coastline. It also is abuts to the San Francisco Bay, which is Carneros. There's a lot of coastal applications now. There's major valleys, Sonoma Valley, Russian River Valley, Alexander Valley, Knights Valley, and more. So there's a really diverse geography, which lends itself, I believe, in a way similar to South Africa, where you have such geographical variation that a place can be home to a lot of different varietals.
Yeah. And you stayed at CIMI from 79 until 96, and you ended up being, I think, CEO, weren't you? I mean, you weren't just a winemaker, you were running the entire show. What was your greatest achievement there, do you think? I mean, because was it Chardonnays? Because the Chardonnays you made, they were pretty amazing, weren't they?
Yeah, I saw that you asked that question. I feel like, in general, my greatest achievement in the wine business has been to mentor women and young men who want to grow into the business, because I was at the lead of just developing the wine business. And so I would have a lot of people come to me, some to work. I had a lot of people from overseas as interns. I was just reading about Peter Sisek, who is working at a new Chateau Restaurant in
and owns Pingus in Ribera del Duero. Yeah,
and he worked for me as a period of time.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, I had a bunch of Australians come over and work with me. So, at the time, of course, I was focused on winemaking. But looking back and looking at the output, I think my support, guidance, and influence on the next generation coming along was one of the things I'm most proud of, especially bringing in young women.
Yeah, I think that's great. Tell us about South Africa. You've mentioned South Africa and had the similarities it has with Sonoma. When did this amazing love affair of yours start with South Africa? What took you there for the first time?
It's quite a story. I had a small group of South Africans come to visit in the late 80s, and they were there as a winery, wanting to look at the new wineries around the world because they were designing a winery. And then I had a small group of other winemakers and wineries from the Cape Estate wine producers. And in both cases, we just welcomed them, did tastings, showed them around, just did all the natural things that we would do for any wine professional that came to see us. Mm. But I understand that at that time, many wineries turned them away because South Africa was a highly racist country. And I didn't even think of it from a political perspective. I thought of it from a wine perspective. After that, Phil and I were married in 1990. And we had been going together in the late 80s. In probably 89, I got a letter from the head of the Cape Estate wine producers asking me to come over and give a lecture on the use of barrels in winemaking. And I talked to Phil about it. Phil had just completed 14 years as the wine grower for Robert Mondavi. And I said, well, do you want to go to South Africa? And we said, yeah, fun, new continent. And, so we agreed, and we were in South Africa in January 1990. And just to put it in a political perspective, Nelson Mandela was released from prison in 1990, February. So we were there at the tipping point. We weren't, as the guests of the Cape Estate wine producers, they sent us to different parts of the South Africa wine lands, and we stayed overnight in several times. They would set up a place to taste and invite local winemakers to come taste with us, and we'd have a dialogue about winemaking. And we were impressed with the soils, the climate, the variation in the climate. I mean, when I said Sonoma and South Africa were similar, I just meant in a small area, you have an enormous variation in soils and aspect and elevation and temperatures that allow for successful growing of a lot of different grapes. So that wasn't necessarily happening at that time in South Africa. There was a lot of control on where you could plant grapes, political control. Mm-hmm. But we thought, gosh, these are ancient soils. It's a marine climate. You could make world-class wines here. And that's really what we wanted.
And you have,
Yes.
Yeah.
No,
yeah. I mean, how did the Villafonte project start? Because then you decided to invest there, right?
I went over a couple times to taste with Michael Fridgen competitions of South Africa versus Australia. And Phil was invited over to a conference, and he started consulting for several other people, including Norma Ratcliffe, Mike's mom at Warwick. And we went back enough times that we began to know various people there. And in time, Michael Back, who was the son of Sidney Back, who had invited us over in the first year that we went, Michael asked if we'd like to do a joint venture. And he had a piece of property that he thought might be suitable. And Phil and I were at a time in our life where I was just leaving Simi, he was just leaving Mondavi, and we were ready for a new adventure. And we thought it would be fun to make wine overseas. And by that time, the land in Napa and Sonoma was becoming expensive to buy land to plant vineyards. We were able to buy this parcel, 100-acre parcel with Michael Back, and plant it for, I think it was the total to purchase the land, plant it, and farm it for 3 years until the vines were producing, was $8,000 an acre. I don't know how much you know about cost. But it met all of our needs. We could afford it. It was exciting. We believed in the climate and the soils. And we had someone that wanted to join with us. In a few years later, it was clear that our vision and Michael Back's vision were slightly different. And we had known Mike Ratcliffe from working with his mom. And he'd been to Australia studying wine. And so we said to him, well, we're going to change our partnership with Michael Back. Would you oversee the vineyards while we figure out what we're going to do? And he said, yeah, I could do that, but I'm also interested in becoming your partner. So that's how it happened.
That's great. I mean, listen, talking of partners, I want to ask you about Phil, because Phil's a pretty amazing human being in his own right. You've said, he's a very distinguished viticulturist. I just wonder what you kind of learn from each other and how you work alongside each other. Do you have the same taste in wine? Do you have the same vision, or do you occasionally clash and disagree about things?
Well, we have the same vision for fine wine. And the Villafante project has been enormously satisfying for both of us. And it was a chance for both of us, coming from slightly different sides of the skill sets in wine growing and winemaking, to join our knowledge and to have our own grapes and make our own wines. It was really, I'd say, the peak for me of my career, to be able to take everything that I had learned, which included, when I was at CME, a lot of working with the vineyards, and with Phil to use his expertise with essentially a blank slate, 100-acre piece of land that had never been planted, and make something that we both saw. We both saw Cabernet as a natural focus in South Africa, because we'd seen some very nice Cabernets, but we felt they could be enhanced significantly, especially through wine. Phil really started the concept of wine growing in the Napa Valley, that you're in the vineyard not to grow grapes, but to grow wine. And that drives the decisions that you make. And he has been incredibly skillful in helping wineries achieve their visions of what's possible with their grapes. And so together with what my winemaking expertise, his wine growing expertise, this piece of land, we just had an opportunity to create something together, and something new, which were the Villafante brands. We were also very fortunate to have Mike as a partner, because the three of us had the same vision, that is, for very high-level quality and very focused. So none of us wanted to try to make 4 or 5 wines, because I knew that as a winemaker in a winery, you can only do so much. You can only focus on so much. And I wanted all of my focus to be on our grapes.
But I mean, you also worked as a consultant, haven't you, over the course of your career, in Germany, in Israel, in the Rhone Valley, Pacific Northwest, where you were from originally. Just tell us what you've learned from working in those places. I mean, are there some places that have challenged you more than others? Some that have inspired you more? Tell us the places that you've enjoyed most.
I think the place that I've enjoyed most was working in Israel, because I was recruited to work as a consultant for Golan Heights Winery with Victor Schoenfeld, who has been the winemaker there for decades. And the challenges there, let me back up. First of all, the Victor and his winemaking group were very sophisticated and very good at what they did. When I started there, they were making many different wines and doing from a dessert wine to sparkling wine to different varietal wines, and then doing them all very well. And it appeared that the roadblock to improvement lay in the vineyards. And at Golan Heights, the Golan Heights Winery was owned by a group of growers. And so the challenge was essentially to educate the growers and get their commitment to change and enhance their viticultural practices. They were basically grape growers, and it was time to try to encourage them to be wine growers. So I came in first to really help change the view of the vineyards and some of the basic techniques. But one of the fascinating things about working there was the land. The Golan Heights goes downhill into the Sea of Galilee, and the Sea of Galilee is below sea level. So in about 30 miles, you can go from below sea level to about 2,000 feet at the base of the mountains that are in the north of the Golan Heights. Now, so again, you have all this opportunity for different temperatures, elevations, aspects. Although the soils are more consistent in the fact that they're primarily volcanic soils. But the environment was fascinating. And after I finished working, I brought several, beyond working the first few years with growers and trying to turn around the vision for the wine. And Victor had to work with the growers to get them to implement it. Then I was working with the red wines to enhance the phenolic work and bringing in some new techniques.
Is there any way you haven't made wine that you'd love to have made wine or not?
Well, I didn't make wine in Australia. I've had lots of Australian friends. It's a very fun group. Well, Tim, I've never thought about that.
Bordeaux? Maybe?
No. From my perspective, I've worked in wine for 50 years, and it's been a growth through my own small winery, a major winery, another essentially international winery owned by LVMH, then to our own project. And that Villafonte project was, to me, like a cap on my career. And in the interim, I'd had a chance to work consulting in many different places, as you know. So I'm happy.
Tell us a bit about your PhD, because you recently completed a PhD. I mean, we all know that you've got this incredible focus, and it's in the performance of art. Now, I was particularly interested in your dissertation topic. Just tell us a bit about that and whether there's a connection you see there between what you were studying and writing about and wine.
Well, I don't think there is a connection. in particular. And you see, I'm essentially a scientist. I trained in general science. I love science. But I felt that my education needed some rounding out into the humanities. So I went back to school to enhance my humanitarian side. And I studied performance because I was actually interested in art, but I'd never had any training or education. And I ran into a distinguished professor at UC Davis who said, why don't you do performance studies and you can study the performance of artists? So I thought, yeah, that sounds good. And then I did a minor in Native American studies, which I also loved. Just, I could talk about why I loved it, but it's part of what I love about Santa Fe is that it has a significant Native American art and artistic presence. So my dissertation was about the performance of a sixth-generation family of Native American artists. So it's an intersection of the nature of Native American families in terms of developing the artistic talent and historical background about the interaction with the white explorers and archaeologists. And it brought together those two components. And I think if there's a link, it's probably in the sense that I have felt that there's a great deal of artistry in winemaking. And you mentioned the sensory component. And of course, we have great art in music, great art in visual art, but the senses of the sense of taste and smell is one of our key senses that hasn't been recognized or developed in the way it could be artistically. And I think in the second half of my life, with the evolution of winemaking and the not only the technical development, but the sense of taste and trying to achieve tastes and working with plants to change their grape chemistry to enhance the tastes that come from them. And the same thing is true in the food world. A great appreciation for sensory differences in food. So that is the link, certainly, between what I was studying and what I was doing. Although
and your life.
Yes.
Just last question. I want to ask you about how you get away from wine. You've got this very rich set of hobbies. It's amazing. And well, I don't know how you have time to rest. And you've got this secret talent in flower arranging as well. I read about somewhere. Just tell us how you get away from wine. Do you need to get away from wine?
Well, I've always used wine as an opportunity to do other things. I went to Tibet 4 times in the 1990s with a curator and a museum director who took Phil and I. And we saw Tibet in its post-Chinese devastation, but still with a very strong Buddhist presence in monasteries and artistic history. That was a revelation to me, historically and artistically. And so I've continued to be interested in Asian art, Chinese art, Japanese art, Buddhist art, but really kind of not a focus because I was focused in wine. But when I traveled in my CME marketing days, I would often stay for a day or two after a trip on the weekend and go and see galleries and museums that were of interest. So and then the same thing happened in South Africa. South Africa, the first winery we worked in, a woman was working there to develop their art. And we made friends with her, and she's still a dear friend. She's a professional curator. And so we started collecting South African art. And, moving to Santa Fe, it was an opportunity to collect Native American art.
Well, and I think it's that hinterland which makes you and has made you such a great winemaker. Listen, Zelma, we could talk all day. I mean, it's amazing to hear your stories. I mean, there's so many other things we could have talked about, but unfortunately we've run out of time. It's been brilliant to talk to you. I hope I'll see you very soon, either in the States, maybe in South Africa or in London. Love to both of you guys. And thank you so much for spending time chatting to us on the podcast.
Thank you, Tim. It's been fun. A pleasure.
Thank you. Great to catch up with Zelma. And I love that story about her missing a plane because she was so engrossed in the New York Times article. Next week on Cork Talk, my guest is Brewer Raats from Raats Family Wines in Stellenbosch. Join me then.
Thanks for listening to Cork Talk. If you want to read more reports, articles and tasting notes by me, go to my website, timatkin.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @TimAtkin and on Instagram @TimAtkinMW. See you next week.